Can I move on to our second speaker, Dr. Alan Rousso? Dr. Rousso's department supports the bank's conduct of high-level political dialogue in countries where they operate, including Ukraine. He also coordinates the bank's engagement with civil society organizations in the context of its projects, policies, and strategies. We've asked Alan to share his perspective on the current crisis and offer an economic analysis of the situation. Alan.
Thank you very much, Paul. I want to echo the thanks that Rory gave to the World Jewish Relief for inviting us, and thank all of you for coming to talk about an issue which is, of course, now very current and very dramatic, and is occupying a lot of our attention where I work. I also would like to congratulate Richard and Paul for identifying the only two prematurely white-haired, bespectacled Americans who got their PhD from Columbia to sit on the same panel. So that's really quite an achievement. It's the first time ever for me. Okay. So just maybe a couple of words about what EBRD is before I talk a bit about the economic crisis that Ukraine is facing today. So EBRD, for those of you who don't know, was set up in 1991, so after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. A number of major countries around the world, not just European ones, decided to set up a special bank to help countries that were emerging from communism to move toward markets and democracy. And so they set up the EBRD with this sort of twin mandate of facilitating countries' transition to market economy and democracy at the same time. The EBRD as an international financial institution is the only international financial institution with a political aspect to its mandate. That makes us kind of special, and it means we have departments like the one that I had that Paul mentioned, where we look at political as well as economic factors, and we look at them together in terms of trying to understand where countries are going in their transitions. Ukraine is one of the founding members and also recipient countries of EBRD. We work in 34 countries now. We've expanded recently into Northern Africa. And we're owned by 62 countries and 2 institutions. The 2 institutions are the European Investment Bank and the European Union. And our largest major shareholder is the United States, so you wouldn't know that from looking at the title of the European Bank, but it's actually an international financial institution. And the European Union countries own more than 63% of the shares of the bank. So we have a strong European flavor and identity, but we are more global than that. So let me now say a few words about Ukraine. It was really helpful and educational for me to listen to Rory just now talk about the ancient and not so ancient history of Ukraine, because I think that's very relevant for us now trying to understand where the country may be going. But let me just articulate 4 themes in the next 7.5 minutes that I may have left. The first is just to give you a sense of the economic crisis in Ukraine in numbers, just so you get a flavor for what exactly the country is facing. The second is a very quick back-of-the-envelope kind of analysis of how they got there. So how did this happen, that Ukraine is in the kind of trouble it's in today? Third is what the new government in Ukraine is trying to do to get them out of the mess they're in. And finally, just a few words on EBRD activities and what we're doing to try and help a global effort to support Ukraine. In terms of the economy, it is clearly on the brink of collapse, and I think we've known that for some time. Had it not been for the Russian bailout of last year, in which they offered $15 billion US dollars in support to Ukraine, the economy would have gone practically bankrupt. So today, the Treasury account in Ukraine is nearly empty. There's not enough money to pay pensions and government salaries. Tax revenues have pretty much dwindled and collapsed. The country has about 15 billion US dollars in reserves in the central bank, which is enough for about 2 months of imports. That was in January. In February, it had gone down to about 12 billion in reserves. So they're just barely treading water. Heavily indebted, so about $140 billion in debt. That's 80% of the country's gross domestic product at the end of 2013. 7 billion of that is due in 2014, so they need financing to be able to service their debt. They have a budget deficit at the end of 2013 estimated at around $65 billion, so they're spending a lot more than they're taking in. The recent developments have resulted in a depreciation of the Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia, by around 12% in 2014, which of course affects the ability of both public, financial, and corporate sectors to service their debts. And the country is stagnating. So it has not grown in the last 2 years. It's actually been in recession since the middle of 2012. There's an expected further contraction in 2014, and that's also partly going to be aggravated by the types of austerity measures that the international community, including the IMF, is likely to impose on Ukraine in order to get an IMF program. It's not something I disagree with, but it's just important to bear in mind that that they are going to be going through a period of pain, just as many other European countries have experienced during the global financial crisis. So that's the crisis in numbers. How did they get there? It's important, I think, also to sort of think about how they started. They started the transition in 1991 at around the same level as a lot of other countries that we now think of as being much more successful, including Poland. So Rory's comments about the links between Ukraine and Poland are quite interesting. They started with around the same level of income per capita in 1991, Poland and Ukraine did. Today, Poland's income per capita is 4 times that of Ukraine. And I can quote a number of other sort of references that would tell you why Poland and Ukraine today are so different. And it just sort of begs the question, why is that? If they're to some extent, the same people, have a common history, why did they not, succeed in the way Poland has succeeded in its transition to a well-functioning market economy and a democracy? And that's the first thing I would point to is democracy. So, I mean, the fact that Poland has a thriving democracy and Ukraine has a partial democracy, I would say at best, is part of the answer, because I think democratic institutions are important to explain the existence of functioning economic institutions, but also long-term and sustainable growth. The second might be history, the fact that they come from different imperial pasts. The Russian Empire versus the Habsburg or the Ottoman or Austro-Hungarian empires. Of course, Poland was in all of those. So it's hard to exactly figure what historical expectations you would have for Poland. I think I would very much take the point that Rory made about not confusing differences between points of view in Eastern and Southern versus Western Ukraine with an identity confusion. But there were clearly differences in Eastern and Western Ukraine in terms of how they saw Ukraine engaging either with the European Union or with Russia. And that's more about their economic interests than it is about their identity. And finally, of course, the fact that there was an EU anchor for Poland fairly early on, that Ukraine never had and still doesn't have, I think made a difference in terms of the incentives they faced to make the kinds of painful choices that Poland made through shock therapy and other things that Ukraine never really did. It went through a process of early privatization and market reform, and then it sort of stalled. And it hasn't really done much since then. It got stuck in transition, which, by the way, is the title of our 2013 transition report, which is our flagship report, where we look at exactly these types of issues in Ukraine and a lot of other countries. It's excellent reading and makes a fine Hanukkah gift, so you should pick that up. So, this is kind of, that's a very global picture of why Poland and Ukraine are different, but I didn't get at what I really think is the key difference between Poland and Ukraine, and some of these other factors explain this key difference, and that is really about the functioning and the effectiveness of state institutions. I mean, that's the real difference between Poland and Ukraine. Ukraine was a corrupt and kleptocratic state. Poland was a democracy with very well-functioning economic institutions. And that really explains, I think, a large part of why Ukraine is stuck in transition. It has a bloated bureaucracy. Corruption is riddled throughout the entire system from bottom to top, including up to the very top. The market system in Ukraine has been monopolized by a group of oligarchs, particularly who control Ukrainian heavy industry, which is the source of a lot of Ukraine's wealth. So there's been limited competition in the economy, difficult foreign entry, very, very weak rule of law, so a completely corrupt court system, which allowed attacks on companies by corporate raiders with impunity. And I could go on. I mean, I think they made very, very limited reforms in education, in the use of land, in public administration, which has really, I think, squandered Ukraine's natural advantages, including its strong human capital and physical capital, particularly in the agricultural side of things. Now, of course, the fact that they had infighting political elites didn't help. So after the Orange Revolution in 2004, 2005, it would have been great if people like Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yushchenko and the others had really gotten together and said, we're going to drive Ukraine in a particular direction, and it had gotten the support from the European Union and others to do that. But unfortunately, that didn't really happen. So I think this is another factor, is that Ukraine squandered its windows of opportunity, and it has one again today. It has an important window of opportunity today, and I don't think it's out of the woods. I think it has, as I'll come to in a moment, a government of people who, 2 minutes, perfect. It has a government of people who understand the challenges Ukraine faces, who talk exactly about the things that I've just been talking about why Ukraine went wrong and why it didn't succeed in its transition. But they have to get it right in terms of pushing those reforms through and staying on track and taking advantage of this window of opportunity. We have a role in the international community to help them, but I think they really have to help themselves. And I think there are some warning signs there. But just let me sort of say what the new government is saying it wants to do to address the sorts of things that I've been pointing to. It sees itself, and I think this is really important, as a government that is probably not going to be around for very long. And that's what you need in a transitional situation. You need a government that isn't thinking about the next election, a government that's willing to do really painful, hard things that are going to cost them votes, but they need to be done. They need to be done if they want to get an IMF program, which also is going to trigger our ability to do some of the things that we want to do. So they really need to do things like address problems with electricity tariffs and prices. This is a very sensitive matter, but there are ways in which you can cushion the impact of tariff and price reform on the most vulnerable, and that's what they have to put in place. They need to reduce subsidies, which they've had in place for quite a long time, which is part of the problem with their government finances, and curb spending. And all of this will be put in place, I'm sure of it, if the government survives through a somewhat perilous period and they get an IMF program. They want to focus on institutional reform, so they've created an anti-corruption bureau, they've created a lustration committee, they want to go after the assets that have been stolen. All of that is really good, and I think if they're sincere and they really put their shoulder to the wheel, I think they can do that. And they aim to restore investor confidence, because Ukraine isn't going to survive only, on its own, on the basis of investment from domestic Ukrainians. It needs to attract Western investment from private as well as public sources, and for that it needs to create a much better investment climate. So with that, let me just close by saying EBRD is working with the rest of the international community to try to help Ukraine. We can do anywhere up to about $1 billion a year in business in Ukraine if the environment is right. It's our third largest country of operations. It's declined in the last year because of the problems I pointed to, but we can do a lot more if the government is serious, and we're ready to do a lot more, and we're working with the IMF and others to put a program in place that is going to deal with some of the vulnerabilities and the most vulnerable parts of the population while putting the country on a firmer track. We're talking to them about anti-corruption, and we have our own anti-corruption initiative that we're going to do there. And we, of course, are focusing on helping our clients. But it's important to bear in mind, we are small. We can't fix Ukraine. Even the IMF can't fix Ukraine. So we are a small player, and our role is really to try and get the private sector going, which is an important part of any country's successful transition to well-functioning markets. Thank you.